Hello my bookish lovelies, Kira here, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of June. I'm trying to hurry up and get these wrap-ups out because I am so far behind on wrap-ups, but I am actually almost caught up with doing wrap-ups, so I'm very excited about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into all the books that I read for June. The first book that I read for the month of June is Slay by Brittany Morris. This is a book that I've been wanting to get to for quite some time. Not just because it is overall just a beautiful, beautiful book, but also because it has gotten so much hype all over the internet, and it is completely and rightfully hyped on the internet. We have 17-year-old Kira, who is this gamer. She actually created her own game that is exclusive to Black people, and you have to have a password in order to get onto it. But that's pretty much a widely known password. It's not a secret among Black people. It's just basically all it is that they kind of share that password. Basically all they do is just kind of share the password. Well, one day this boy who plays the game got murdered for the virtual money that her game has, because this boy had a ton of money. Because of this, her game begins to get scrutinized by the public. She has to either hide from everything, or she has to kind of try to figure out what she can do. She's very panicked and it's very stressful for her. In the midst of everything that's going on, somebody comes in and tries to disrupt her game, and she ends up going into a bet that could potentially force her to lose her game and everything that she's worked for. So nobody actually knows the real identity of her and the fact that she is the creator of the game named Slay. Really, this is such a beautiful book about having a place to go when you don't feel like you belong anywhere else. And it was just such a beautiful exploration of that. It also has a lot of racial injustice and being angry, being self-prejudiced, I guess you could say, because there is some of that in there too, without telling you who it is, because if I tell you who it is, it's going to ruin things for you. So I'm not going to get into that because this is non-spoilery, but I really enjoyed this. This was such a great book. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars because I just was sucked into it. The plot itself was just a steady pacing, and it was just such a fun, interesting, such a fun, crazy, imaginative, wonderful read, and I totally recommend this one. The next book that I read is Be Not Far From Me by Mindy McGinnis. This takes place circulating around a bunch of high school students, and these high school students, they decide to go camping, and they're out in the woods and they're drinking, and Ashley goes and she takes a nap for a little bit, and she comes back and she finds her boyfriend cheating on her with his ex. So she gets upset and she runs into the woods, and in the midst of everything she crushes her foot, and then she basically doesn't know where she's going, where she needs to go, and she's standing in the woods trying to figure out how to get back to where she was. She spends a substantial amount of time out in the woods trying to find her way back to civilization, and she has to figure out how to survive during that time. This book is very gritty in traditional Mindy McGinnis style, because she never really leaves anything to the imagination. She's always just very blunt about how things are, but she puts it very simplistically, very straightforward. And I found myself really rooting for this character. I was really hoping that she'd survive, but it also went through and kind of reflected on how she learned how to survive, her mentor before, and how her mentor before had actually gone into the woods and disappeared himself. So it's a lot of exploration and trying to find, loose ends and everything else. I really enjoyed this. It was a really quick read. I read it in about a day, and I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in the month of June is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is a fantastic paranormal romance book, and I kind of got A Court of Mist and Fury vibes from this. It wasn't so much that there was fairies in this, there was actually vampires, and it was just, oh, it was so good. It kept me at the edge of my seat. It's 600 pages that I just absolutely flew through and am so addicted to. So Poppy is our main character. She is chosen from birth to be the maiden. The maidens actually sacrifice themselves during the Ascension. She is actually serving a Duke and Duchess that is part of the Ascended, but because she is so important, there are guards from the palace that come and protect her against everything, all the outside forces, because there are evil forces out there called the Wolven and the Atlanteans that would kill her, because it would benefit them and weaken the Ascended if they did. I will say like that there is like a little bit of trigger warning like in here for abuse, because like it gets pretty graphic like in some areas, but I really had fun with this. Poppy, being the fact that she's a maiden, she cannot go out without having a veil on. Nobody's allowed to see her face. She is just very protected. She always has 2 guards around her at all times, and she has a handmaiden, and the only people that are allowed to see her without her veil on is the Duke, the Duchess, the handmaiden, and the 2 guards like that she has in her employ. That she spent her whole life super sheltered. This book starts out in a bar one night like where she decides like that she's going to go and try to experience something before like they kill her during the Ascension, because part of the Ascension is like that they empty you out of life so that the gods can fill you up and you live an unnaturally long amount of time, and you end up taking a bunch of other people with you. And she runs into this man that she recognizes as part of being the Duke and Duchess's, one of the Duke and Duchess's guards, and he's very sexy and, you know, like very alluring, and like, you know, she's very intrigued by him. Things ensue, and there's like a bit of a romance in here, which I really loved. Like, I loved the romance in here. Hawk is just, he amplifies like Rysand vibes pretty frequently like in this book. So I love this book so much, and I highly recommend it. This was also a 5 out of 5 stars for me, and if you guys haven't noticed, like so far, like there's a trend. I read a lot of 5 out of 5 star books in the month of June. It was just a really good reading month for me. The next book that I read is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. This was another book that I read during the month of June, and it is all told in verse. So this is told on 2 alternating perspectives. You have Camino, who lives in the Dominican Republic, and you have Yaharia, who lives over in New York, and you see like both of their lifestyles, like how they are both radically different. Camino is actually like, she's towards like the top socioeconomic statuses in the Dominican Republic because her father works in the States a good portion of the time, and he sends home money, and so like that kind of makes her well off like than a lot of the other neighbors that live in similar circumstances. This goes back and forth, and Camino is always at risk for being trafficked by this local guy who kind of like employs girls to sexualize like them, like with other like, you know, tourists and stuff like that. Like if a tourist is like looking for a fun time, or like one of the local guys like, you know, like are looking for a good time. And basically like they didn't say he's a pimp, but like I kind of got pimp vibes from him. And like, you know, he's like looking for girls like that he can pay money to, like to sleep with a lot of these guys. So he's actually been targeting Camino lately, and she's just like, no, my father paid you off, you know, like like he pays you and I'm not interested. And she's like, I don't need you. And he's basically like, yes, you do. So he stalks her a lot. So there's like a trigger warning in here for stalking. It's kind of like a dark situation, but Camino has always dreamed of moving to the United States to become a doctor. Yaharia, on the other hand, lives in New York, and she has a girlfriend, so there is like LGBTQ rep in this as well. And she lives in New York, and she lives with her mother, who is this like kind of upper class, very sophisticated type woman. And in the midst of everything like that's going on, you know, like with all of this, their father gets into a plane crash and dies. And they know nothing about each other. Like, he had 2 lives that neither one of them knew anything about one another. So basically, like, this is the exploration of them discovering who they are, and Camino discovering that Yaharia exists, and Yaharia discovering that Camino exists, and like that their father had 2 lives like that he led and didn't tell either one of them about the other. This was a very hard-hitting book. I really enjoyed this. This was so good. I only have one thing to say about it, and that is that the voices of Yaharia and Camino, like when I was going back and forth because they are in alternating chapters as far as narrative goes, I had a really hard time depicting like who was talking. So I had to go back through like to the beginning of the chapter and kind of remind myself like off and on like who was talking. I don't feel like the voices like were super different from each other, and I don't feel like they were super distinctive. Other than that, like everything else like about this book is just freaking amazing, and it was very hard hitting, and I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now, during the course of everything, I ended up picking up another book that I got really addicted to. It is actually by the same author that of the book that I just talked about, Clap When You Land, Elizabeth Acevedo. This is actually the very first book that she had published, The Poet X, and this is also told in verse. This is a masterpiece, and I do recommend listening to an audiobook. This audiobook's like only about 3.5 hours long. Like, it doesn't take long to get through, but like every single solitary minute of this had me at the edge of my seat, like wanting to hear more. I was so emotionally invigorated by this book and the poetry like in it, and I just feel like this whole book is just a wonderfully emotional, in-depth masterpiece, and the audiobook like just really drew me into it, and like I just felt the power behind the voice, because a lot of this is spoken word poetry, and you don't really get the spoken word poetry if you read the book. You get it more like when you listen to the audiobook, and oh, man, like it was just so amazing. Like, it was a masterpiece, and I as soon as I was done listening to it, I wanted to start it over again, but like I really just was kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna sit back for a few minutes and I'm going to like go ahead and like listen to it like again like as soon as I can, because like there was so much in this to absorb, and it was just so beautiful. Xiomara is the main character. She lives in Harlem, and she is trying to find her place as a 15-year-old girl who is growing up like in a community like where she has to kind of figure out like who she is. Her mother is really devoutly religious, and she feels often kind of oppressed by her mother and the religion like that her mother wants her to be a part of. It's not the fact that she doesn't believe, it's just that she doesn't believe as hard as her mom does. Her mom was in an arranged marriage, and previously her mom had wanted to become a nun. And that never happened for her, because in order for her like to go and help to not only provide for her family, but to provide for herself and kind of give herself some security, she ended up having to be in an arranged marriage that led her to the United States. And so that was kind of her legacy. But Xiomara is trying to figure out her legacy, and she ends up joining a slam poetry club. And okay, this book's like really an experience, and you really can't quantify verbally like how amazing this book is unless you read it. So this is another like one that I just think is just so fantastic, and I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. Another book that I read during the month of June is Harleen by Stefan Sajic. I can't pronounce the name, I'm so sorry. But this is actually a graphic novel about how Harley Quinn got started. Originally she was known as Harleen, which, because Harleen was a doctor, she actually like, you know, worked in Arkham, and that's where she met the Joker. She was trying to prove like that history of having too much trauma can actually create somebody evil, or, you know, like people like that do evil. Because at the heart of everything, she believed that she could help people. So when she meets the Joker, she has already like watched all of his history, and she kind of like becomes enraptured like with him. This kind of like alludes like nonstop like to her, you know, like future and everything, like, and how, you know, like several months like down the line, like that everything would be changing. But this was just, oh, this was so good. And it was just, it felt so complete. And like, I really felt like I knew Harley Quinn like after this, and like in the psychology behind her. Like, she was really like isolated when she went to college. She fell in love with her professor, and so she really didn't have any friends. That's a trend that kind of became consistent throughout her entire life. And so she was looking for people like that she could connect with, and the Joker just ended up being one of them. So this is another like one that I ended up giving a 5 out of 5 stars. Like, this was so good. So good. If you guys like want to learn more about Harley Quinn, how she got started, her psychology, everything, the way that this character's developed like just made her seem so three-dimensional, and it was fantastic. The next book that I read in the month of June is White Rage by Carol Anderson. This is a nonfiction about Black racial injustice in the United States, pretty much like from the time like that slavery was still a thing until present day. The story itself is only like about 178 pages, like, and the rest of what's in here is citations. This is such a great in-depth look at the history of racial injustice, like how the legal system played into that, how like every like step like in the right direction ended up kind of being a step back. The things that I learned in this book, I was never taught in a history class. I was never taught, you know, like that Abraham Lincoln, for example, like, and this is a perfect example. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's primary goal was to unite the North and South. In the history books, like every history book that I've learned, you know, like in public school setting, I learned that he was the one who freed the slaves. And yeah, he did a little bit for them, but like the president that came after him, pretty much not only like did he reverse everything that Abraham Lincoln did, which was not very much, but he also went through and he figured out like ways like to make it even worse. So this was definitely like really eye-opening. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars because like I learned so much from this book. I feel like this was like not highly detailed, but it was detailed enough. It's a very dense text for like only being 178 pages, but I took in so much information and I highly recommend this one, like if you are looking to explore more of the racial injustice like that happened in the United States. The next book that I read is All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. This is actually a YA biography for the LGBTQ plus community. This is all about George, who is a queer boy living in America, and it really digs into a lot of like different things. It digs into like a little bit of racism and, you know, being queer and, you know, having like prejudice against you for being both. And this, what I really liked about this is because I read White Rage, and this gave me like a very objective point of view. This actually gave me more of an emotional point of view, which I really appreciated because I felt like it allowed me like to kind of see more from an first person perspective about like what this did to somebody emotionally, like with all the racial injustice. So I really just loved this book. Also, like this was kind of like his development into being open about him being queer, and family acceptance and like what kind of family like life he had, which was very supportive, which was wonderful. He learned like about, you know, like what it was like to kind of get a community like that was supportive, like outside of the household, which was a lot more challenging. And it was so good. The main like reason he wrote this is because he didn't feel like there was enough literature targeted towards young adults that talked about like, you know, being queer and being black at the same time. And he wanted to make sure that he created something like that people could go back to, and especially like teens, and have a safe place to go so that they can learn more about being queer and being gay in America. This was another 5 out of 5 stars for me. I flew through this. It was so good. I loved every second of this, and this is such another one that I highly recommend. The next book that I read is The Deep by River Solomon. This book was kind of interesting. It's not very long at all. This was about mermaids that lived in the ocean, and these mermaids were descended from slaves that had been brought over on a boat and jumped into the water, and these slaves like had given birth to these mermaids. This was so interesting. These mermaids like were non-binary pretty much, and so like they could actually fluctuate between like, you know, being male or female. However, the main character, in spite of like that aspect, was primarily referred to as her. Wan Jinru is the main character, and she is the holder. She's the historian. She holds all the history of her people, and during periods of sharing, she has to go and she has to share that information like with the rest of her people, because this allows like them to forget the trauma that was a part of their history, and it makes her the carrier of that burden. Basically, the only release that she gets is during the period like where she shares everything with the rest of her community. And during like the next sharing, she decides to go away because this trauma like that she's feeling like on a day-to-day basis from the history that she remembers, not only does nobody understand because nobody remembers it, because like she takes it all back in with her as soon as like you know, like they've remembered it, but also it's kind of destroying her like health-wise, and it's just really hurting her. So she goes and she ends up meeting a human that she really kind of connects with, a female human. This was such an amazing experience. I absolutely loved this so much. It was so good. Main thing like that I really like kind of struggled with on this, I felt like this story, because like there was so much to it, could have been a lot longer. And I felt like there was a lot like that we didn't like really get to see in-depth accounts of because of how short it is. And that to me, like, I feel like this could have been better fleshed out, because I love this so much, but I just wanted more, like much more. And I don't feel like that I got that from this. So I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. Like, this is still a really brilliant book. Like, I still highly recommend it. And the world itself is just so creative and so unlike anything like that I have experienced before. And I really like everything like that's in this. Once again, like, I just wish like that this would have been longer and they would have kind of like, you know, expanded on the actual story in this a little bit more like than what I got. So the last book that I read in the month of June is The Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. This is the third book in the First Law trilogy. I don't know if I will have that. I did a full review, a non-spoilery review of all 3 books in the trilogy, and if I have that up, I will leave a link, otherwise it's still coming. This is the last book in the trilogy, and the other 2 books built up to this book. Everything that was in the previous book built up to this one, because like this is definitely a slow build grimdark fantasy, and it takes time. Like it took a lot of time like to develop the characters, the world, the conditions for the world, and the final resolution, because basically like this is 600 pages of us just dealing like with everything like as far as like the final resolution goes that the other 2 books set up. This was so good. I really struggled like with the first 2 books because they didn't feel complete, and they felt like we didn't like really we got a few twists, but they didn't really feel like we got like any genuine like story twists that I was hoping to see, because each book is not a complete book unto itself. Like you basically have to like read all 3 books like to get like really get a complete view of the whole series. So this was a solid last book in the trilogy. Now there are more books like that come after like this that do not follow the same characters, but they exist in the same world, and I'm really looking forward to those too. I love this. Once again, Glauca is our comic relief in so many ways. Like he's like one of the darkest characters, but like he's also like one of the funniest characters. I never realized torture was funny before I read something like this. Like he makes torture hilarious, and I didn't even realize that was a thing. So I loved Glauca like by far and above. And it's funny because like now that I've read this, I've noticed like that everybody who's read this is talking about Glauca. Glauca is like the person. Glauca is like the man, and I love him so much. He's just so brilliant. One of my favorite characters literally of all time. And I've read a lot of books, so the fact that Glauca like has become like a character like that, one of my favorite characters like literally of all time, I think really said something. This is also a 5 out of 5 stars. So I read a total of 10 books during the month of June, and I had such a great reading month. Like I read so many amazing books. I loved it so much. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you guys like this video. If you guys like this little video, hit the like, hit subscribe, little bell icon if you want to receive emails every single time I post. I am also on Instagram, Twitter, Amazon, and Goodreads. Those links are linked in the description below. And I will see you guys again very soon.